If you ever need a lesson in how not to run a country, just ask Vladimir Putin. Consumed by his obsession with Ukraine, Putin has allowed Russia to go to the dogs. He tried to hide it, of course. For several years, it looked like Russia's economy was surprisingly resilient to the impact of sanctions and the money vacuum that Putin's war has become. But like so many of Russia's athletes in the past, the country's economy was on steroids. Now, the heart has given out. There is no cure for the state that Putin has led his country into, and there is one symptom of this problem that stands out in the summer of 2026: fuel shortages all over Russia. Over the last 4+ years, Putin has done a relatively good job of shielding the Russian population from the war that he started. Sure, the arrival of Western-made long-range missiles in Ukraine put the border regions at risk, but that was a minor problem. Those regions should expect conflict anyway, being so close to Ukraine. The development of Ukraine's long-range drone sector was a bigger problem. Since around 2024, those drones have been making appearances deeper and deeper into Russia. But still, the true impact of the war had been hidden. For years, Russia's economy seemed strong, and its fuel situation wasn't an issue. But in 2026, everything has changed. Russia is running on fumes, in more ways than one. In the very literal sense, Politico reports that 2/3 of Russia's 83 regions now report that they have problems with their fuel supplies. Millions of Russians are having to deal with countermeasures, which extend from rationing through to the outright refusal to sell fuel to anybody who isn't part of the military or the emergency services. The crisis runs deep, and it may well be the first truly unavoidable sign of Putin's war that all of Russia has been forced to face. As Ukraine's drones batter more oil refineries, take out depots, and even destroy fuel trucks as they make their way through the occupied territories, there is fear spreading among the Russian population. One woman named Irina tells Al Jazeera, "I'm deeply frightened by the uncertainty and the lack of understanding where the situation is heading." A Moscow resident named Igor added, "I think things can get out of control if the crisis causes major industries to shut down." Igor doesn't know how right he is. For as damaging as Russia's fuel crisis is to the perception of the Ukraine war that Putin has tried for years to maintain on his own turf, this fuel crisis is a symptom of a much wider problem. As much as 25% of Russia's refining capacity has been taken offline, Fortune says, and there are reports of people waiting for 18 hours or more at the pumps just for a chance to get some gas into their cars. The problems that Putin has tried to hide for so long are now as plain as day for all to see. The fuel crisis is the malignant sign of a disease that Putin himself helped to create. Like the toadying excuse for a leader that he is, Putin is both trying to hide from what is happening while taking the rare step of admitting that maybe, just maybe, something is going very wrong for Russia, its fuel industry, and its wider economy. On June 28th, the Kremlin made a big song and dance about how Putin had summoned top officials to discuss Russia's fuel crisis. That doesn't mean much. Putin is so detached from what's actually happening in Russia that the best he can do is point at a problem and tell others to fix it, somehow. Putin is trying to pretend that he isn't detached and that he can relate to the Russian people by admitting that the infrastructure strikes he can no longer hide are having an effect. There is a certain deficit in Russia's fuel supplies, he says, though he claims that it isn't critical. It seems pretty critical to the millions of Russians who are dealing with the pumps being empty. These shortages are paralyzing business owners who can't run their companies without gasoline, and mothers with crying infants who can't get their cars fueled to drop their little ones off at daycare. But here's where all of this gets really serious for Putin. Fuel prices in Russia are rising. And those rising prices have an impact on Russia's rate of inflation, and according to the Russian central bank, that impact is going to last a lot longer than it has in the past. Politico points all of this out, stating, "An existing government agreement on price restraint with the major oil companies may help keep official prices down, but anecdotal evidence points to a rise in unofficial fuel sales at hefty markups, which businesses can't help but pass on to their customers." The impact is going to be inevitable. When businesses have to pay more, people end up being the ones out of pocket. For Putin, this kind of news is like a heart attack waiting to happen, but then that's basically been the perfect description for Russia's economy since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Russia's fuel crisis may be the most obvious thing that Putin can no longer hide from his own people. However, the economic shambles that is being revealed in the wake of that crisis is Putin's much bigger issue. Putin has been exposed as the man who pumped steroids into the economic heart of Russia for years. Now that heart is about ready to go pop. Let's take a trip back to 2023. By that point, the Ukraine war had been raging for around a year, and the Western world had collectively implemented an array of sanctions that were designed to punish Russia by crippling its economy. But Putin had a plan. Like a doctor with a needle full of performance enhancers, he was going to pump up Russia's economy by making the switch to a wartime industrial complex, a move that Moscow used to completely confound observers who thought the nation would instantly collapse following the invasion. And it worked, for a while. The steroid of military industrialism pumped through the Russian economy's heart, and it led to gains that nobody expected. According to the World Bank, Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP, growth was 4.1% in 2023. In 2024, GDP growth was even higher, 4.9%. As though watching a sprinter complete the 100 meters in 9 seconds, the world was left collectively scratching its head as it wondered how the hell this had happened. Russia's GDP declined by 1.4% in 2022, the year that Putin started his war, so how could it not only be growing, but growing so impressively a year or two in? Putin knew the answer, even as he hid the roid-addled needle. The economic resilience being seen inside Russia was a sham. Yes, the switch to a military-industrial complex could explain part of it. But as the European Leadership Network points out, Putin was injecting plenty of cash into the Russian system. It says that the period between 2022 and 24 saw Russia implement fiscal measures equivalent to using 10% of the country's GDP, all to prop up the military-industrial complex, ensure wage growth, and keep lending numbers high. It was a smokescreen, an illusion. But still, for a couple of years at least, the heart of the Russian economy seemed to be beating well. Russia's president was happy to wave these results in the face of anybody who would listen. The 2023 and 24 growth figures were Putin's rebuttal to anybody who thought that Western sanctions and Ukraine's efforts, even combined, would be enough to sink the Russian economy. As GDP soared, average wages rose, and even unemployment dropped. Russia seemed to be doing well. But Putin had made a critical mistake. The steroids he had pumped into the Russian economy were never cycled. It was just constant propping up, for years at a time. The heart of the Russian economy was starting to struggle, even if it seemed stronger than ever by the end of 2025. Beat, 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 then flatline. The heart attack happened, and Russia is never going to be able to recover for as long as Putin's war rages. But before we dig deeper into that, this is The Military Show, and we share the stories beyond the headlines. If you're enjoying what you see, make sure you hit subscribe and click the notifications button to see more of our deep dives into Russia's many Ukraine war problems. When 2025 rolled around, Putin believed that business as usual from the last couple of years would continue to work. The needle goes in, pumps the military-industrial complex full of cash, and then it's pulled out until more cash is needed. But what Putin didn't reckon on was that his defense industry solution to a massive economic challenge couldn't last forever. The money would run out, as would the labor, and Russia's GDP would fall off a cliff. And that's precisely what we saw in 2025. The World Bank says that Russia's economic growth dropped to just 1%. It's still growth, but it's a rate of growth that represents a free fall compared to the 2 years prior. 2026 is going to be even worse. Russia's current economy ministry forecasts have been downgraded from expected 1.3% GDP growth at the start of the year to just 0.4% now. Again, a decline. If this pattern continues, Russia will find itself in recession in 2027. From flatlining to pop, the Russian economic heart is done. That's what you get for falsely pumping up your economy, and Russia is feeling the impact. Right now, that economy is in a purgatory somewhere between complete stagnation and the militarization that Putin forced onto Russia after he invaded Ukraine. Do you remember those low unemployment figures we mentioned? They're more a sign of the complete lack of labor in Russia rather than a healthy economy that is functioning as it should. Russia's national welfare fund has been depleted by billions of dollars, all to fund Putin's war, and much of what Russia spends its federal funds on is classified, including 80% of the defense budget, so it's difficult to see where the money is really going. Putin's big mistake was to create an economy where the military-industrial complex dominated everything based on his assumption that Ukraine would fall fast enough and deliver billions in mineral wealth that would allow for the ship to be righted after the war ended. Ukraine hasn't fallen, and the Russian ship is taking on tons of water. Now, earlier in the video, we talked about how Russia's fuel crisis is a symptom of the broader economic problems the nation faces. What do we mean by that? Well, it all comes down to inflation. We mentioned that Russia's fuel prices impact broader inflation in the country, and that's what we're seeing. Even as Russia tries to keep prices down by placing price restrictions on oil companies, The markups that come with unofficial sales are countering those efforts. For instance, in Sevastopol, which is a Crimean port city that is among the worst affected by Ukraine's campaign against Russian fuel, prices at the pumps increased by 30% in a single week, the Moscow Times reports. This indicator of inflation is an issue for Russia. Inflation was already a problem. Prices across the country rose by 2.1% during the first 2 months of 2026 alone. But that's child's play compared to the 10% inflation levels seen in 2024. Russia now worries that with the economy cooling, the rampant fuel crisis spreading, and the measures to curb inflation failing, a new inflationary spiral will be entered where prices explode once more. The Russian central bank is already trying to respond. Its most recent key rate cuts only brought Russia's base interest rate down to 1/4 point, to 14.25% in June. That's already so high that it's making lending difficult for businesses that are crying out for cash, but Russia can't risk lowering the rate much further because of the inflation problems. Some argue that Russia's economy has cooled enough to bring the rate down faster, thus prompting more lending. But that pesky fuel crisis isn't going away, and the risk in trying to lower the key rate is that inflation might rise again as a result. It's a no-win situation. And it's clear that anything that Russian economists try to do to fix the situation will mean a half measure at best. Most are united behind the simple point that Putin's war in Ukraine is to blame for everything that we're seeing now. It's Putin's policy of pumping the Russian economy full of steroids that created a false picture. It's Putin's fault that the heart went pop and the economy flatlined. And it's Putin's fault that there is a fuel crisis racking Russia right now. Of course, no top Russian economist is going to outright say that. But it's implied every time they say that they favor an end to hostilities. That's a veiled way of saying, end your insane war before you drag Russia down with you, Putin. Alas, Putin won't pull out of Ukraine. He has taken Russia to the edge of the financial abyss, and he's going to push it right over because he is so obsessed with Ukraine that he can't even see the gaping maw that stares back at him. Here's the reality that Russia faces right now. The explosive state financing that gave the false impression that Russia's economy was doing well in 2023 and 2024 doesn't exist anymore. Oil and gas revenues have fallen off a cliff, partially due to Western sanctions and partially due to Ukraine's kinetic sanctions tearing through refineries, depots, and storage facilities. In May, Russia's oil output dropped for the 6th straight month. 2025 saw Russia's federal budget oil and gas revenues fall by 24%. We'd have seen something similar throughout 2026 were it not for Operation Epic Fury and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz giving Russia a temporary reprieve. However, oil prices are normalizing and could fall to $60 per barrel again by the turn of the year, oilprice.com reports, so the windfall that helped Russia for a while is already disappearing. The defense-related manufacturing sectors into which Russia poured so much cash are starting to struggle, as a production dead end has been reached due to there simply being no remaining capacity to build. The draining of civilian labor from the Russian work pool is another problem. That labor either went into the defense sector or into Ukraine to die, and it means that businesses outside of the military-industrial complex lack talented people at a time when they're still struggling with sky-high interest rates. There's no recovery coming from any Russian sector that isn't directly involved in the war, and those that are involved are maxed out and can't grow anymore. And all the while, the state cash that acted as the Russian economy's steroid continues to dry up. Russia's GDP contracted during the first quarter of 2026 as the country's budget deficit continues to grow out of control. The Hill reports that inflation is on the rise again, realizing the fears of those who are wary of bringing key rates down and showcasing the impact of Russia's fuel crisis. And Ukraine isn't going to stop. It won't run low on the middle and deep strike drones that are doing so much damage to Russia's fuel industry, crippling Putin's war machine, and taking out so much of the expensive military equipment that even Russia's bloated defense sector struggles to replace. There is no denying it by anybody who is paying attention. The malignant cancer that runs through Russia is Putin, and there is no cure other than cutting him out. Of course, Russia is still trying to pretend that the situation isn't as bad as it seems. In a June 10th piece, the Moscow Times reported that Russia's finance ministry claims that there is no budget crisis in the country, despite the budget deficit having widened to $83.5 billion during the first 5 months of 2026. Deputy Finance Minister Irina Okladnikova even claimed that the budget is being executed according to schedule, which makes us wonder what type of schedule was in place. Apparently, that schedule must have included the budget deficit exceeding Russia's target by 60%. as oil and gas revenue fell by 30% during the first 5 months of 2026. It doesn't make sense to claim that everything is okay when Russia is on fire, but then this sort of approach is Putin-esque. Kick the can down the road and hope that the Russian people are willing to endure more hardship for the sake of his war. The Russian people aren't buying it anymore, not that Russia has all that much to sell in the first place. In a June 30th article, Fortune reported on a Gallup poll, which revealed that 60% of Russians are pessimistic about the outlook for their economic future. Conditions are already bad, and they're only going to get worse. That number is also up 21% from the 39% who expressed similar pessimism in 2025. So it's clear that a breaking point has been reached, and everyday Russians have realized that Putin's broken promises and economic failures are making their lives worse. Of course, there's a big difference between realization and active rebellion against a failing leader, but it's a start. And Ukraine will be hoping that it all leads somewhere. After all, Putin is too obsessed to stop. Or perhaps more accurately, Putin knows that bringing about any end to the Ukraine war that doesn't allow him to parrot a supposed victory, such as the fall of the Donbass, would be another broken promise in half a decade full of them. Still, an opportunity has arisen for more pain to be piled on. More sanctions, particularly those aimed at Russian shadow fleet ships and the nations that both purchase from those ships and act as go-betweens for the transport of sanctioned goods to Russia, could plunge a knife into the steroid-addled heart of the Russian economy. Will those sanctions come? Only time will tell. But even without those sanctions, there is no cure to the double dose of Putin's inept economic policy and Ukraine's destruction of the weak foundation on which the Russian economy is built. A fall is coming. Those in the hours-long queues at the gas stations are among the first to see that fall happening. There is simply no coming back from the economic problems that Putin has created for Russia, and we've only scratched the surface of the many issues the nation now faces. We have so much more to show you, and you can see it all if you watch our video, where we uncover the reality behind a Russia that is now on the ropes. And if you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to ensure you never miss any more of our analysis of the dreadful state that Putin's policies have left Russia in. And thank you as always for watching.